Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here today with Rob Bauer, Professor of Finance at Maastricht University, to discuss his paper, Mental Models in Financial Markets, How Do Experts Reason About the Pricing of Climate Risk, which he's co-authored with Katrin Gödker from Bocconi University, Smeets from the University of Amsterdam, and Florian Zimmerman from the University of Bonn. So thanks very much for joining me today, Rob.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about a research project, Tom. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and it immediately interested in me because it's a survey paper, and I've been through the pain of doing survey papers. So I wanted to share your experiences with our viewers. And your paper seeks to investigate financial professionals' beliefs about climate risk pricing and analyze how those beliefs influence stock return expectations. Why is this important to understand, and why did you conclude that a survey paper rather than archival research was the best way to address this?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, it's probably not a real surprise that beliefs on climate change actually differ between individual portfolio managers and analysts, which is what we found. But we are especially interested in the question why they differ. Why do these return expectations and these beliefs differ? So essentially, we are interested in the question, which lines of reasoning do these portfolio managers and analysts that we study actually have? And we call that mental models, which is sort of a new term in the literature since recently. And archival data cannot really help us here, directly at least, because you don't know, you cannot look into the minds of portfolio managers and analysts based on data. So you really have to survey them and do an experiment, which we also do and we did that actually jointly with the CFA Institute in the US, so that we could have access to a global sample of portfolio managers and analysts. And then you asked me the question, why is it then important? Of course, if you study asset pricing, you want to know about how people make decisions, how they form beliefs and maybe even preferences, and how that impacts the pricing of assets. In this case, on climate. So that's a real academic rationale to study this, but could also be very practical. Imagine that you are a pension fund and you delegate assets to a particular asset manager. You would really like to know which beliefs that asset manager has on climate and whether they are synchronized with your beliefs. Or maybe you don't want that because you want to have somebody with orthogonal beliefs on yours so that you learn about it. So you can make this very practical as well.
Yeah, and I mean, in this short discussion, we won't have time to go into the details of your methodology, so viewers are going to have to read the paper for that. But I would like you to highlight some of the key findings. So first of all, you asked people how important they think climate risks are and whether they believe stock prices under or over reflect climate risks. What did you find?
Yes, so let me go one step back. We are especially interested in the question how financial experts reason about climate change and whether this reasoning is related to their return expectations. That's the key research question. And in order to know that, we're going to ask them how important climate risk is important for asset pricing. So that's, of course, a lot of diversity in answering there. When you look at the answers on that question, you see a nice normal distribution ranging from not at all important to extremely important, and a lot of people in the middle, somewhat important. And we also find that a majority of respondents actually believes that climate risk is not sufficiently reflected in stock prices right now. A smaller group, however, believes that markets are paying too much attention, too much reflected the topic of climate change in pricing assets. So you see a lot of diversity of opinion, and we want to know why that is. Why do some people think it's important and others not? And why do some people it is already reflected and why not? And maybe if I can add, we also find that people who believe that climate change is important and who think that it's not fully reflected in asset prices yet have a higher likelihood to believe that an index like the MSCI Climate Action Index that we use in our analysis, an equity index, that this index will perform better than the regular or the conventional MSCI equity index. So it's quite interesting that there's a connection between the beliefs they have and the return expectations that they have regarding climate.
Yeah, and that will come back to that. And you sought to elicit the reasons for the mispricing, and you used a mix of textual analysis, of free text responses, and also some structured questions to do that. What did you conclude about the main families of beliefs on climate pricing, and what did you find about how these beliefs differ by geography and political orientation, which I thought was quite interesting?
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially given the year that we're in.
Mm.
We find essentially three key mental models, or maybe lines of reasoning is maybe a better word to use here.
Mm.
So one of them is related to data availability and data methodology. Maybe you can sort of summarize it as data quality. We label this sort of a market friction. The data is not there yet, or it's composed or constructed in a way that can be attacked. And therefore, a lot of people have issues with that, and that determines their beliefs and on climate risk for that reason. The second is a bit more a behavioral friction, or behavioral element. The not so relevant beliefs we found, because only a few people mentioned that in the open text, the essays, is, for instance, some people say it's a hype, it will pass. That could be bounded rationality argument, or it is a short-termism type of argument. But the biggest we found in that category of behavioral issues is actually the fact that so-called second-order beliefs, or in other words, what I think you think. So a lot of people actually, and as a great example, yesterday there is this online journal called top1000funds.com, in which CalPERS makes a statement: we're going to do a climate action plan, we're going to invest in public and private markets, and we're going to reap alpha from that. So if you think about it, why would they do that? They would only do that if they actually think that others are not paying attention to that right now, because then they can reap the alpha. What I then don't understand is why they give a press interview.
Yeah,
because
before they've done it.
Others, so I would do that after the fact. But there's an important point mentioned in the essays, is that a lot of people tend to say, I know about the topic, but others don't know yet, and therefore I have certain beliefs on this climate index versus the other index. There's also a small group who says exactly the opposite. They say, others are paying way too much attention to that, and I know that, and others don't know that. But that is a smaller group, and I come to that in a minute, where they are likely to be found.
Yeah, I mean, I find that really interesting, actually, that of course when you're trading, it's what you think other people think is every bit as important as what you think, right?
Exactly, and you could even go one step further to third or fourth order beliefs, but then this conversation will never end. So a smaller group of respondents also mentions a third category, policy measures such as legislation, regulation, or taxes, as an argument why they have certain views on it. But that's a relatively small point. So the biggest two groups were the data quality related and the beliefs of other participants.
Okay.
What we find then, and that's, I think, this is something that you can then filter out of the essays, but we also ask them to make a prediction on the climate action index versus the conventional index, and we find that these beliefs are very consistent with their predictions. So, for instance, experts who believe that others do not give enough weight to climate risk have higher return expectations for this climate index than those who have a different view, or the opposite view. So their mental model is that this neglect sort of leads to mispricing, and therefore they can make a profit out of that. And you asked me a minute ago, do you see some geography issues and political preferences? Indeed, we have sort of three additional results you could distill out of all of this, is that experts who are scoring right on the political spectrum, we asked that in a certain way that people in political economics tend to use that, that people on the right spectrum tend to believe that others give too much weight to climate risk. And that actually only holds in the North American sample. So we have a global sample. So overall, we find this. But when we then dug into the details, we found that this left-right distinction is mainly the issue in the US, which is, of course, quite explainable by what we observe there in the political spectrum.
Yeah.
So
I want to pick up on a couple of issues that came out there. So one was, you said that we have people with this group of beliefs where they expect there to be outperformance from this kind of climate index, when in general they believe that climate change is important and it's underemphasized by other people. But you asked another question, which was around over what time frame do they expect that mispricing to be resolved, and that raises some questions about actually how easy it would be to trade on that belief. Can you just unpack that a bit?
So when we started discussing that with the author team, the topic of limits to arbitrage came up, but we sort of removed that out of our paper because essentially it's not really arbitrage. You have a view, it's not 100% certain, absolutely not at all, given all the uncertainty that we have. But yes, we asked respondents when the mispricing in their views will be resolved. And many answered more than 10 years. And quite even a large group, like 30% or 25, I don't know the numbers by heart, answered it will never be resolved, whatever that means. And it can have many reasons.
It's difficult to know what that does mean, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I think it can have many reasons. For instance, they have the view that national parliamentary democracies will never solve this, and we don't have a global parliamentary democracy. The UN doesn't function and all that. So they have a very grim view on us being able to solve this. In the end, we will, of course, have to adapt. So then we still have to work on that together. And so acting on those views then is complicated because you have a view that at some point it will be resolved and then you can profit from this alpha, whatever it is. But if it takes ages, then it's quite a risky strategy to think that happens. So I think what I just said about CalPERS is they must have a view that when they buy the stuff now, that at some point in the, let's say, the cycle of CEOs being and CIOs being evaluated, it must be resolved. Otherwise, they will not reap that alpha.
But that is clearly going to be a constraint, isn't it, on the extent to which people trade on these views. I'd now just like to get into a little bit more detail on this work that you did on return expectations. So this was very much focused on the that kind of mental model of second order beliefs, so the views on what other people thought. And you used that to try and elicit, you related that belief to views on return expectations. Could you just give a little bit more detail underneath what you did there and what you found?
So are you now referring to the information intervention we did?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what we did is we were intrigued by the second order beliefs having such a big relevance in the essays. Essentially, we were already expecting this somehow because when we set up the whole analysis, we had to already create this information intervention into the system. And what we did is, so we gave one respondent group information, this is the information intervention, that the majority of a small sample of the actual CFA service respondents that we already got in thinks that climate risk is really, really important. So 9 out of 10 or something. And that most in the sample also think that it is not sufficiently reflected in asset prices yet, or in equity prices in this case, which you would expect them then, if that is relevant for them, that new information, maybe way more than they themselves thought about it, you would expect them to upwardly shift their return expectation because it's less reflected and it's very important. Therefore, you expect a higher return on the climate index. And we had a second group, similarly, who got negative information. It's, it's not that important and it's already quite reflected in asset prices, and you would expect them to lower their return expectations. And that actually happened. So after this information intervention, in this one group, we see the returns go up, the first one that got the positive information, and the other we saw it go down. And in the control group, the third group, nothing happened with the return expectations. So essentially, we conclude this information intervention is really important. There seems to be a causal connection between the order beliefs second order beliefs that people have and their return expectations.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes some sense, doesn't it? Because actually, I mean, that sort of information intervention can plausibly influence somebody's beliefs about what other people think. I mean, you're not going to change somebody's mind with that sort of information about their own views, but actually what you're showing here, that what counts is what they believe about what other people believe. I wanted to come back to this point about what risk it is that investors believe is not being priced. Because when I looked at the index, the climate action index that you were using to ask people their expectations about, it's an index that looked to me, when I looked at its constitution, it was quite heavily weighted towards a sort of managing transition risk. There was a little bit in the portfolio weightings about physical resilience, but mostly it struck me that it was kind of a transition risk index linked to carbon emissions and so on and so forth. So can we conclude from that actually it's transition risk that these respondents believe is being underpriced, or can we not go that far? Or is there anything that came out of the free text responses that you got that gives any insight to this?
Yes, a good question. So when we presented this at several academic but also practitioner conferences in the last few months, we got similar questions. One was related to yours, transition risk versus physical risk. I delved into the index methodology again after getting those questions. And the way MSCI describes it is that they score the MSCI Climate Action Index on carbon emissions management. So that's more the transition risk, I would say. But also climate change vulnerability, which is physical risk.
Physical risk, yeah.
Then you got biodiversity and land use, which could be both. Could be both transition risk and also physical risk. And then they also have something they call opportunities in tech management, green building, and renewable energy. So I think it's a combination of the two.
Yeah.
So yes, it's fair to say that it's probably a bit tilted to transition risk, but it's not just transition risk.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what they have in their minds, these analysts and portfolio managers, we can only interpret what they write. And so this got us to sort of do a next step in the essay interpretation, that we're now researching how they write about the channels that they use. And one of them is physical and transition risk, indeed. So do they write about, indeed, carbon emissions as a reason for all of this, or is it more the tornadoes and everything related to that, or floods? But the other one is also the channel. Are they talking about cash flows that might be impacted by climate, or is it the discount factor that is going to be impacted by it, which is a huge, of course, and how you think about this. And maybe finally, we also got the feedback when we presented it, especially with practitioners, because they knew the index. They said, "Hey, listen, Rob, nice story, but if you give this question to me, the Climate Action Index actually has a little bit more of NVIDIA and other IT sectors compared to the conventional one." So I was a bit stressed when I heard that. But when I went back to the actual index, it's indeed a 3 to 4% higher allocation to those companies versus the regular index, which cannot explain the huge differences in the return expectations of the whole index. So luckily, that is not a real topic, but they could have the mental model. This is an IT index, and therefore, so it's very complicated.
It is complicated, but I mean, I think that's something we have to accept with survey papers. Is I think they're a really valuable way of opening up key questions that need to be considered. But you have to recognize that you're never going to get definitive answers, because you can't ever absolutely predict what people were thinking when they responded to them.
Absolutely.
And in that vein, I mean, what sort of avenues of research do you think this survey paper motivates for the future?
Yeah, so in the academic space, a lot of contributions, both theoretically and also empirically, have been submitted and published in the past few years on how to, let's say, asset price climate risk, how to price it into assets. So I think our new insights on the belief formation process might help some of the theoretical contributions, and also maybe predict certain empirical, and we can then test that. That's one of the things I see directly. Also, what I just talked about, that experts made it based a view on a cash flow channel versus discount factor. I can imagine that you also take that into account in those models.
Yeah.
What is really intriguing me, and I'm not a behavioral economist, my co-authors are, is the fact that beliefs and preferences, who both play a big role in those theoretical models, may be interacting with each other. You cannot easily disentangle them. So it might be that my beliefs are preference-based. So I have a certain preference. I don't like this whole climate thing. It's a hope. And therefore, my belief is that they will not perform.
Right, yeah. So
or is it the other way around? I have the belief that it is really performing, and therefore I like climate change. So that is something that I see as a really cool paper to write in the future, to focus on that, and then how that indeed has impact on asset pricing.
And
maybe psychology can help us here, because this is not a problem, preference-based beliefs or beliefs-based preferences, is something that in psychology is a big topic for years already, but it hasn't really gotten too much to the financial domain yet, I think.
Well, there's an opportunity for any aspirant PhD students
There
watching
you are.
this. So
Exactly.
look, Rob, thanks very much. Really fascinating discussion.
Okay, thank you for having me.